Okay, welcome to another edition of South Hill Bible Church Sunday School for Adults. I'm John McMath. I've been there and done that, so I've got 5,000 slides from a moving Jeep, and we'll show you some more today. The thing we've been working on is a kind of an introduction to Joshua and Judges. We're looking at background and context and stuff that's going on to make Joshua Judges happen. You know the stories, I suspect. So I'm going to try to tell you the rest of the story and some of the background. So far we've been looking at the biblical world on the eve of Joshua's conquest, understanding how the larger geopolitical situation at the time made the conquest possible. And everybody said, well, wow, that's quite a coincidence. You know, if the biblical story is accurate, and most of the critics say, no, of course it's not, and the dates are accurate, and the critics say, but of course they're not, then that would be an amazing coincidence. And my answer is that God doesn't do coincidences. And some of this is really fascinating. So we looked at Egypt for a while. Egypt is a great southern power. In the biblical narrative, and all the time we go through, there'll be a king of the north and a king of the south. And the king of the south is always Egypt. Sometimes includes Ethiopia, Sudan, but Egypt is the big power, the Nile. Okay, and Egypt was always the big dog on the block. They were the power to the south, and the shadow of Egypt was always over what we call the Levant, or Syria, where Israel is going to find its homeland eventually. All kinds of interesting stuff. I'm going to review this map one more time because I want you to catch it. And that's where we're going to start out today. Let's pray, and we'll take a look at some of this background. Father, thank you. We appreciate our time together. We appreciate the ministry that you've given this church around the world. We appreciate the privilege that we have of studying together and of attempting to understand your word just a bit better. Pray, Father, for insight this morning. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, if you look at this map, you see just 3 titles in big print. And those are the ones I want you to catch. In the south, Egypt, the Nile. In the northeast, title called the Mitanni. And I'm guessing that you've never heard of the Mitanni before. The interesting thing about Mesopotamia in general is that there's a sequence of powers. Minor powers, great powers, little powers, big powers, Semitic powers, Indo-European powers, all kinds of things. And Mesopotamian history is the most complex in the region. And it climaxes with the last great empire of the ancient world, which was Persia, which comes all the way down to the Greco-Roman period. The Persians are trying to get back on the front burner. They're trying to be important in the world again, which is why they so badly want a nuclear weapon today. Nothing ever really changes. Once you understand how history sets up, it's just the way. The Mitanni were one incarnation of an Indo-European people group in Mesopotamia. They come after the old Babylonian power, which is a bit farther south. The Mitanni were farther to the north. We think they came from Central Asia, a group of people that we usually call the Scythians. None of that makes a whole lot of difference, but they're kind of an Indo-European power, and they were there for a while. To their immediate left, to the west of the Mitanni, in what is modern Turkey, were the Hittites. And up till 100 years ago, of course, the critics said, well, there were no Hittites. Everybody knows there were no Hittites. It's silly to talk about Hittites. Oh, here is the capital of Hattusa, and right over here is all, and then suddenly the whole Hittite Empire just appeared out of the dust of Eastern Turkey. And became very interesting. I'm going to show you a little bit of the Hittites and the Mitanni, and I'll show you what happened to them. You can probably imagine that the Hittites and the Mitanni would compete for the land that's available at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That was the conflict point. Looking south, either the Hittites or the Mitanni, or sometimes both of them together, would try to gang up on Egypt. And sometimes Egypt would gang up on either a Hittite or a Mitanni force. And so the three powers were always jockeying for position. And the center of conflict, the Schwerpunkt, if you will, the point of contact where the damage is going to get done, is right in this narrow little strip between them, the land between. And so if the Egyptians want to beat up on the Mitanni, they're going to have to drive through Israel and beat up on the Israelites for a while before they get there. If the Hittites decide to beat up on Egypt, they're going to have to drive through Israel and beat up on Israel for a while on their way to the main event. It always worked that way. And many of the monuments that we find in Egypt, in the Hittite territory, and in Mesopotamia are records of the expeditions of various 12-cylinder named Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Hittite kings on their way to and from beating up on the other major powers. On our way to kill the dangerous and terrible Mesopotamian power that has been oppressing the world, we oppressed the cities of so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and took away spoil and slaves and whatever. And that's usually Israel and the other minor powers. So it becomes important to take a little, see if I can get this. Let's take a look at the Hittites, see if I can do it. There it goes. Okay, this is one of the main gates into the city of Hattusa in Turkey. And it's not a place that's widely visited. It's a dangerous part of Turkey. It's in the borderlands, not too far from Syria, and therefore you've got to have military permission, and it's a pain in the neck. But anyway, it is possible to get to Hattusa. There's a lot of Hittite archaeology. The Hittites spoke a language that is Indo-European, but really, really, really ancient Indo-European. It's more closely related to Sanskrit than even Greek. It's a very, very old language. And it became a written language around 2000 BC with the adoption of the Akkadian, previously Sumerian cuneiform. Cuneiform is an interesting language. I don't have any pictures of cuneiform, but you've all seen it. You take a sharp stick, a little wedge-shaped poker, and a bit of wet clay. Okay, so you make a tablet out of wet clay, and while it's still wet, you poke these wedge-shaped sticks into the clay. You know, poke, 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 and each one is a pictogram. Now, there's some 2,700 odd pictograms. And so here's a duck, and here's a house, and here's a hornet, and here's a whatever. And when they put a certain combination of pictograms together, it can become some kind of a verb. And they do other things, but sometimes over time, some of the pictograms could also be used as syllables. So you can put together a sounded out kind of a word, like a name, like Shupiluliuma, the king of the Hittites around 1360 BC, has a name in cuneiform that takes up 4 syllables. Okay, well, once you know how to pronounce the Akkadian version of cuneiform, you can guess at the pronunciation of the Hittite version, which is awful. A fellow in University of Chicago named Harry Hoffner has literally devoted his entire career to the production of a Hittite dictionary. It's at, I think it's at 19 volumes now. His students are doing most of the work on it. But Hoffner may have died by now. I didn't get the note, but they've been working on it forever. Virtually nobody specializes in Hittite. It's considerably less popular than, say, gender studies at the University of Chicago. It's not, and there's not a big market for Hittite specialists. Seriously, what do you do if you there's even less to do than in a gender study major. But the Hittites are actually fascinating. There's a lot going on with them. Let's see if I can make this.
John, can I ask you a question? Did they find these this gate kind of, or were they just there when you went to look at this place?
No, this was an excavation site. This was excavated about 100 years ago. I think the French did this. And what they found on the surface was pottery. When you're doing, in archaeology, the first problem is to identify a site that might be worth looking at. And the way that's done is a survey. An archaeological survey means you get 100 or so grad students, as many as you can find, who are willing to volunteer a couple of weeks in the summer. And you spread them out over 100 yards or whatever you can manage, and they're all following a compass. So they walk a straight line for as far as you'd like them to walk, all the way across this valley, over the top of that hill over there. Then you turn around and set up another 100-foot line and come walking back the other way, and you keep an account of everything that you find and where it was. And what they're looking for most of the time, what is likely to be found, is small pieces of pottery. And so they'll pick up a small piece of pottery and make a note of exactly where it was found. At the end of the couple of weeks, there'll be a map that shows the concentration of small pieces of pottery all over this area. And you take each of those pieces of pottery and assign a probable date to it. That's really hard to do. You're looking at shapes and sometimes the material that it's made of, and you assign a more or less likely time frame to it. It actually is just as esoteric as it sounds. There's a lot of tea leaves in this. The archaeologist at the end of the day will say, in this broad valley or this area of the province, there are 4 antiquity sites, 1 very large one and 3 relatively small ones. And the archaeologist says, well, this large concentration might be interesting, especially if there's a mound associated with it. And so they see this mound, and the pottery says, in the range 2000 BC to 1000 BC. Okay, well, that's interesting. And that's how they found Hattusa. It was the French, and they did a survey, and then they came back with a full-fledged expedition. I've forgotten all of the details, but they did a pretty good job. They were primarily looking for monuments, so they found this. This is the Lion Gate at Hattusa. This is the kind of thing that can only be built by a nation state. I mean, a central power builds stuff like this. This was not built by somebody as a backyard attraction. It wasn't something to decorate the pool area. This was a major monument of something. So they kept digging, and eventually found the cuneiform tablets. And with that, they got names of a whole bunch of other places. They began looking for other places, and over 100 years, we found several dozen Hittite sites covering most of Eastern Turkey. A lot of stuff, and it demonstrates that the Bible was right all the time about Hittites. Beyond that, it's given us some insight into the politics of the period. And so we have copies of treaties that the kings of the Hittites made with the Mesopotamian powers, the treaties that the Egyptians made with the Hittites, the wars that they fought with one another. We've got lots of details. Whole lot of holes in that map. There's a lot more we don't know than that we do know, but there's a lot more now. They came from somewhere about 2000 BC. Prior to 2000 BC, we have 0 written records of the Hittites. History, by definition, begins with somebody writing something down. If nobody writes it down, it literally didn't happen. Once they start writing, you've got a shot at learning something about them. If you can ever get to that point. And sometimes they'll tell you the legends and the mythology of their beginnings, and sometimes you can actually learn something from that. But for the Hittites, they appear out of nowhere at all, around 2000 BC. And they're going to stay on the scene for a while. Hattusa is the capital, we're sure of that. We know that the Hittite New Kingdom extended all the way into what we today call Syria by about 1420 or so BC, just before Joshua's conquest. We've got Syrians, or we've got Hittites in Syria. King Shupiluluima came to his highest power toward the end of the Amarna period, around 1344. And it was probably Shupiluluima who fought the Battle of Kadesh. Well, no, that Battle of Kadesh is the Hittites, the next king of the Hittites, facing off with Egypt. Kadesh is on the Orontes River, a bit north of Damascus. And at the time, Kadesh on the Orontes was a really big deal. And the Battle of Kadesh in 1280 BC is the earliest written record with details of any battle in the ancient world. We know that these people fought with each other before this time. But for this one, the Egyptians and the Hittites both have provided us with written histories of the event. And it's fascinating. Ramses II faced off against the Hittite king, and it's fascinating. The Hittite king simply blew his socks off. Ramses made a rookie mistake, bad mistake.
With all these battles you're talking about, it seems to me you come across a lot of skeletons for people?
No, we never find skeletons. No, typically on an ancient battlefield, if we're lucky, we'll find, sometimes we'll find metal parts. If it's into the Iron Age, we can find iron heads. During the Bronze Age, the bronze iron heads are fairly rare. We did find one at Lachish. One of the men in my group found a bronze arrowhead at Lachish, but they're not very common. Part of the reason for that, we visualize, we think of, great armies deploying on this broad battlefield and hundreds of thousands of men beating up on each other with sticks. And it wasn't like that. The kings of the ancient world were relatively minor players. You think of, great King Shupiluliuma peering over the horizon with 50,000 archers and 100,000. No, it was nothing like that. He might have had a dozen archers and 200 or 300 infantry. And that was good enough to conquer the world in those days. Okay, so it's not a huge thing. Now later on, by the time we get to the Assyrians, we're looking at larger armies. But the really ancient stuff, very rare for it to be anything bigger than just a few hundred people.
Do we know how far back, like the machinery were, like chariots?
Chariots?
How far back?
Yeah, the earliest we see chariots in the literature is about 1700 BC. The Hyksos who conquered Egypt appear to have had chariots. The earliest chariots, a lot of scholars think, came from the Hittite country because they have iron there. You're sending me down a rabbit trail. Can I do a quick rabbit trail? Chariots are very interesting. They really are. Everybody thinks, well, you just go out in your garage and you just put some wood, you build a little platform, get a couple of wheels from the hardware store, and hire a horse or two for the afternoon, and you got yourself a chariot. That's completely wrong. The typical chariot, at the height of this thing, when the Egyptians were deploying chariots by the time of the Exodus, an Egyptian chariot was a complex piece of high-tech equipment. It was built by engineers and experienced craftsmen. Nobody built a chariot in his garage. A chariot was a very, very expensive weapon system that was built by the lowest bidder, okay? The same people that built submarines for the Navy, isn't that right? Yeah. He can neither confirm nor deny that, but it's yeah.
Hebrew for chariot is Merkava, which
Yeah.
is the name of their tank.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
That's
Merkava
what they were in
tank.
the ancient battle.
There's a museum on Highway 1 from, or whatever the highway is from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, just on the left near Tel Gezer. There's an armor museum. They've got a Merkava tank literally cut in two down the middle, so you can look inside and see what. I mean, this is an old tank, and they retired it and put it in the museum. And they've got all kinds of tanks, lots and lots of captured Russian tanks. They've got American tanks. They've got a bunch of tanks. But in addition to all of that, they have the previous examples of armored stuff going all the way back to the chariots. They've got reconstructions. The actual chariots are gone. Chariot wheels were made of wood. And you break a chariot out in the battlefield someplace, and it rains for a season or two, and you don't have a chariot anymore. Okay, they rot fairly quickly. If you had a chariot wheel that fell into the Red Sea, it's been gone so long, even the fish don't know where it was. People who say, oh, we found chariot wheels in the bottom of the Red Sea. No, you didn't. You found an interesting coral structure. You haven't found chariot wheels. I guarantee that. At any rate, how did I get there? But a chariot wheel is complicated. The chariot box is complicated. It has to be lightweight but strong. They investigated lots of different things. The Hittites first used what we would call a war cart, 4 wheels made of solid wood on solid axles with room for 8 or 10 guys, and then pulled by oxen. And sort of moving into battle. And they discovered that this isn't very practical, because it moves so slowly, it sticks way up in the air, and the bad guys can see you coming and shoot you. So it isn't very practical. They decided, whatever we do, we've got to have something that we can move quickly. And to move something quickly, you need 2 things. You need fast horses and lightweight chariots. So the horses are one whole thing. The breeding of fast horses became a very big deal. And there was a lot of discussion early on, the design phase of all of this. How many horses is enough horses? 1 horse is lightweight and easy to handle, but 2 horses is faster than 1 horse. Well, I bet you 3 horses is faster than 2 horses. What would happen if we had 4 horses? And it turns out it was almost impossible to breed and train 4 horses to the same level. And there would always be a fast horse and a slow horse, and 2 more in between. So that never became popular. The 3-horse chariot was somewhat easier to do, but it was prohibitive. 1 horse just wasn't enough. They ended up with 2 horses. And so when you see the Egyptian chariots, you'll normally see a 2-horse chariot. Now, those 2 horses have to be matched. And they have to be fast horses. So you don't want, if you're the guy that gets stuck with the 2 cute, adorable little mares, trotting into life and death mortal combat on it's not going to work. What you want is a snorting great stallion, and you need 2 of them. And those stallions need to be bred for strength and endurance and all the right things, and courage under fire, whatever you've got to put in the genetic code. And they pick out the best horses. So there's horses being raised all over the place, and the top several percent is like a SEAL team. There's a reason that 5'3" cute little blonde cheerleaders don't end up on SEAL teams. The same reason. There's not all the horses in the world that make good chariot horses, and the problem is you gotta have at least 2. So the raising, the breeding, the training, the care for horses was a full-time job for a whole bunch of people. Okay? It literally takes a village to raise a horse. That was often the main thing done by an entire village of people who raise horses. At the same time, the craftsmen building the chariots themselves used, when we can figure it out, and I'm not sure we've got it entirely figured out. And scholars say there are as many as 28 different kinds of wood and other materials used in the construction of a chariot. It kind of depends on the chariot, where it came from, but that's a good beginning point. The chariot wheel itself, different sizes were experimented with. Would it work good to have really big wheels, or small wheels turn faster? And they discovered all kinds of interesting things along the way. The wheels have to be lightweight, because everything in a chariot has to be lightweight. But it also has to be strong enough to endure travel over rough ground and occasional sharp turns with bad things happening in every direction. So they started off with solid wheels, big chunk of wood, too slow, doesn't work, and eventually it shattered. Not good. They tried a 12-spoke wheel, which didn't work, too heavy. And when it broke, it tended to break really badly. You couldn't fix it. So they well, let's go for a lightweight. They tried 4 spokes. Now let's talk about some of the actual things that are going on here. You've got a hub, and the spoke has got to come out of the hub and come out to this rim. You want the rim as narrow as you can make it. And in that rim, you've got to make a mortise, preferably round. In the ancient world, it was extremely difficult to make round holes. We just take a drill and go, we've got it. But in the ancient world, it was not so easy. It was actually quite difficult. And it took very experienced craftsmen to make holes in the chariot rims that were the right shape for the tenon of the spoke. Because it was too tight and they drove it together, that produces a stress point, and when the wheel is in use, it will shatter. If it's too loose by a couple of thousandths of an inch, it will provide a wiggle point that will eventually produce a stress point, and the wheel will shatter. Shall we put bronze around the outside? They experimented back and forth with that. They realized that if you go with just wood, you've got lighter weight, and especially the swung weight of the wheel itself, and so you're going to have a lighter and strong and quick chariot. If you add the metal, it's going to start getting heavy. But if you don't add the metal, and eventually they went to iron, and that was the best. The iron chariot means a chariot with iron wheels, or rims on the wheels. That lasted the best. They finally came to the conclusion that 6 spokes, carefully made with iron rims, was the very best chariot wheel. And those were made by top end, to apprentice in the shop that made chariot wheels was a lifetime commitment. And you would eventually become a master chariot builder. And again, it takes a village to build a chariot. And it would be the major industry of an entire village. And if you were going to try to field an army with 1,000 chariots, that means 1,000 villages are busy building chariots and raising horses, training drivers, and training soldiers. The Mitanni in particular, we'll talk about Mitanni in just a moment, majored in chariots. They had a minor in economics and a major in chariots. They were really good. Their chariot warriors, the archers, soldiers who rode in the chariot next to the driver, were lifetime professionals. These were guys who trained specifically for this job from childhood. They were scouted. We have records of that. The scouts would go out and find promising rookies, and they'd get drafted into the chariot corps. Just like a modern football or basketball draft. They'd be there and they'd be available, and they'd get into this when they're about 12, 13 years old, if they were already really, really, really good at whatever they were doing before then. And they'd have a chance for this, and the scouts would be out there and they'd find the kid. And he would become, in the Mitanni language, a Mariano. Literally, it means a noble warrior. And he would be an officer and a gentleman, if you will. He immediately attains officer status, actually cadet officer status, and would be trained. And the training lasted for many years until he was good enough to actually go into battle with the chariot. It was just a very complex thing. So if you've got an army of 1,000 chariots in the ancient world, that's literally a world-class army. Think of a chariot army in the ancient world as the equivalent of a modern aircraft carrier battle group. You've got your carrier, you've got a couple of cruisers, you've got the destroyers around, you've got a couple of nuclear submarines that are doing their duty, you've got the maintenance ships, you've got the rest of it, you've got however many aircraft the thing can carry. Small countries don't have those. The Philippines doesn't have an aircraft carrier battle group. Why? It would be so nice to have, because if you have to ask how much it costs, you really can't have one. That just isn't. So the ancient world would put out these chariots, and not just everybody had a chariot or a chariot army. When the little kings, the kinglets of Canaan, wrote back to Egypt saying, we've got a problem with the Habiru, they're invading, they're crossing the river, we could really use a chariot here. One chariot and another dozen arrows. Please, if you can do without it, we could use a bronze sword or two to equip an army. You need that? Okay. So Hittites are interesting. Battle of Kadesh, one of the earliest things we ever saw. Ramses made some stupid rookie mistakes. He had an army with 3 divisions and a headquarters unit. And they came down out of the mountains of Lebanon into the plains of Syria. They could see Kadesh off in the distance. Kadesh was looking peaceful with a bit of a fog bank over the top of it. And Ramses decided, let's take our army, which is spread out here in the mountains, and just cross the river down there. But before we do, let's see if we can find some local that knows where the Hittites are. And so he sent some scouts down there. They talked to a local who said, Hittites? Oh no, they were here several weeks ago, but they were terrified. They knew that your majesty was coming to destroy them, and so they ran. They're far, far away. Now, of course, they weren't. The Hittite army was hidden in the fog behind the city of Kadesh. And so the first division came down, put itself together, marched off past Kadesh, missed the Hittite army altogether, and climbed up into the mountains on the far side. The second division came down, associated, got itself together, started marching past Kadesh. We're getting ready to head up into the mountains when the headquarters division with Ramses came down onto the flat land, and they organized themselves and started marching past Kadesh, while the third division was still coming down out of the mountains. The first division is up in the hills on the far side, and at that point, the chariots of the Hittites came out from behind Kadesh and attacked the flank directly onto the headquarters unit. And Ramses puts up, when you go to Luxor, one of the things that you'll see is that Ramses, surrounded by Hittites, pulling his own bow, which of course is absurd, but pulling his own bow, slaughtering Hittites left and right. Those of you who've been in the military probably know that if the headquarters staff is getting attacked by bad guys, somebody has made a serious mistake. Okay? If the headquarters unit is under fire, things have gone very south really quick, and heads do need to roll. But at any rate, Ramses' chestnuts were pulled out of the fire by a randomly assigned group of naval cadets who were on some kind of a march from Lebanon. And they walked onto the field and found out this was going on, and so they jumped in and began. Yeah, it's a funny thing. So Ramses declares victory, and also the Hittite king declared victory, and then they both pulled out of there and left the battlefield for the locals to clean up. That turned out to be the high water mark of both empires. About 80 years later, the Hittites were destroyed by the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples, we think, have something to do with the Philistines. And that's a difficult thing. Who were the Philistines? Where did they come from? Why do we care anyway? Well, we care because they're a major problem for Israel all through the Old Testament time. They probably came from the Greek islands. This is what we think. When Santorini exploded, the Minoan civilization came apart. The Sea Peoples began migrating, and they migrate with an army and a bunch of civilians. And they were in ships and on land. They came across Turkey fairly slowly. The 1200 is about 300 years after the explosion of Santorini. Yeah, so I'm not sure the theory entirely holds water. But we do know that it was Sea Peoples who probably destroyed the Hittites. Before the Sea Peoples destroyed the Hittites around 1200 BC, the Hittites destroyed the Mitanni. Okay, so this just happens to work. Okay, so there's the Mitanni, and here's some pictures of some Mitannian king hunting lions. And again, seriously, if the king is spearing a lion in the act of pouncing on him, his handlers have let this go too far. This scene never should have happened if it did, and it probably didn't. At any rate, the Mitanni appeared in Upper Mesopotamia around 2000 BC. They were a problem for the old Babylonian kingdom, and then did some other things. In the Old Testament, they're often called Hurrians or Hivites. They're an Indo-European people. The Mitannian language has not been well studied. We don't have nearly as much. Also cuneiform, interesting people. Their capital was a city called Washugani, and I know it's easy for me to say. We don't know very much about Washugani. The king, during the high point of the Mitannian kingdom, was Tushratta, who reigned from 1385, about 15 years after Joshua conquered the land. So you've got both of them. And they became more and more and more powerful in Upper Mesopotamia, Syria, until the Hittites defeated them. And then the Sea Peoples defeated Israel. So during the period from about 1400 until about 1200 BC, there's a lot of conflict to the north that doesn't pay a lot of attention to Israel. And the Egyptians occasionally would go up and beat on either Hittites or Mitanni. And Israel would have been a small, nomadic group living in the hill country of what is today Israel. We talk about the West Bank. Please don't say that. West Bank of what? Well, the West Bank of the Jordan River, the part of Jordan that's on the west of this river that runs through it. No. That's Judea and Samaria. Okay, that's a New Testament term. So older, that's the Israelite homeland. No, that was never Palestinian territory, ever. There was never a Palestinian state. There was never a Canaanite state. There was never a Hittite state here. Even the Egyptians didn't call this home. This was flyover country, okay? Nobody made a home here. Okay, so Tushratta, Mitannian ascendancy, lots and lots of conflict in Syria. So we can think of the three world powers trying to control Syria, where Israel is located. The Mitanni, the Hittites, and Egypt, and just fighting over them. This goes on forever and ever and ever. By the way, this is a city in northern Syria. This is Antioch, another famous place, and not much to see. Circa 1380 or so, the Hittites conquered the Mitannian lands around 1365. The Amarna, Egypt, just happened to happen at the same time. 1400 to around 1350, give or take a bunch in either direction. The Egyptian king Akhenaten, in addition to being rather crazy, had no particular interest in military conquests. So what we have happening at roughly the same time, the Hittites are beaten up on Mitanni. And so the Mitannians disappear from the world screen. The Sea Peoples are getting ready to wipe out the Hittites. And so the Hittites are going to disappear from the world screen. And Egypt is taking a break. All right? And so there was peace, more or less, in Syria during this whole time. In the vacuum caused by the world powers dealing with their own problems, the minor powers in the area began to assume a certain governance and role in the broader power. One scholar that I read years ago said, while the cats are away, the mice will play. Now that's what's going on here. When we look at the conquest itself, that was probably a fairly minor ripple in the whole panoply of the world powers. That was not something that made the daily report in Mesopotamia. It just wasn't. It wasn't a big enough deal. There were migrant terrorists appearing to beat up on some of the tiny cities along the trade route. Expect some delay if your army needs to be transiting the trade route. The Google map at that time would have said reroute along the King's Highway, and there wouldn't have been much more. So it didn't change the world. As Israel grew during this time, we see the Judges period unfolding. A lot of the conflict that we see during the Judges period is in fact the result of the external powers passing through, causing a certain amount of conflict, and then the local powers rising up to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and the judges would rise up to do a little bit of the other. It's a chaotic time, but also a time when all of the minor powers, Israel, the Philistines, Lebanon, which was the Phoenicians, the Syrians of Damascus, these were Amorites, the Ammonites who were in Ammon, the Edomites and the Moabites who inhabited the edge of the desert, and the normal migratory people, Ishmaelites of various sorts, the Amalekites, and all of the various other nomadic peoples were out there and they were doing their thing. So Israel is right in the middle of this. It's very unlikely they made much of a splash. And people ask, well, if Israel was in the land from 1400 BC, why didn't we find great cities and monuments and all of? They were living in tents. Okay. When in 930 BC, when Solomon's reign is done and everything gets split, and Jeroboam and Rehoboam are negotiating a future, and Rehoboam is too stupid to give an inch. Jeroboam shouts, "To your tents, O Israel, what have we to do with the house of David?" To your tents? It's almost 500 years since we left Egypt, and they're still living in tents? Well, of course they are. That's what they did. And for the most part, they didn't move back into the Canaanite cities. those Canaanite cities were re-inhabited by the same old Canaanites, who then, during the Judges period and thereafter, were the big metropolitan centers, the great economic centers of the country that the nomadic people of Israel went to sell their goods, to buy what they needed, and to learn how to worship other gods. The Book of Judges tells us, and so there arose up a generation who knew not the Lord, nor what the Lord had done for Israel. Why did that happen? Because the conquest is not what we think. It was a big deal, and it's important in biblical history. But the Canaanites didn't go away. And they were, in fact, the metropolitan, educated, rich, well-connected, powerful people of the surrounding area. They had the big cities. And very slowly that the Canaanites were either defeated or moved away, very slowly. The kings of Israel, for the most part, tried to fortify and build out the great cities. And most of those great cities had been Canaanite first. When we dig in a place like Lachish in the Judean Shephelah, we find at the very top, we find remnants from Great Britain. Sometimes there's a foxhole on one corner of Lachish that dates to the 1967 war, which is kind of fun. You know, the archaeologists picking out the, 308 rounds, picking out these things, the cartridges and magazines and parts of a machine gun. It's kind of interesting. And everything goes in plastic bags and it's all shipped back to Tel Aviv, and that's the way it is. But as we go down further, we find artifacts from earlier and earlier and earlier. We find the very clear Israelite period goes all the way back down to, I believe it's level 7. Today we've got a 7A and a 7B, but it's all the way to level 7 is the Israelite occupation. And earlier than that is the Canaanite occupation. And that boundary, the burn layer at Lachish, happens at about 1400 BC. We can tell that from the pottery. And I'm not going to get into all of that. It's fun to get into. At Lachish, one of the most important signal pottery styles is the ordinary, daily, mom's favorite dinner pot. If you're gonna put out a dinner with hummus and grilled goat and some peppers and some other vegetables, you need some pots to put them in. And if you're gonna have a big pot of hummus, it needs to be about that big around. And during the late Bronze Age, they began actually at the end of the Middle Bronze Age and into the Late Bronze Age, about 1500, the Canaanites had introduced a thing called a carinated pot. And they were made everywhere. It was like today, my wife got a set of china for our wedding. And it was Noritake. And I don't know what particular style, but that was the style that was popular 50 years ago. Today, if you buy a nice set of Noritake china, it will be a different style. So there was a style. And every woman for her wedding day got some carinated pots, and they all had a shape like this and this, a sharp edge. The earliest ones had this nice sharp edge, knife sharp. They learned over time that a knife sharp edge in pottery is going to break off. And the women complained, My pot has this broken edge. It's not broken enough to throw away, but it's broken, and I would surely love a nicer pot. And eventually the various potters who made pots for Canaanite people made the carination less and less and less sharp until it was finally just a bump around the outside. And we can calibrate the date that the pottery was made to within 25 years for the whole period from around 1500 to around 1200 BC in Canaanite sites. Yes. Yeah, it's cool. So when we say, oh yeah, here is the carinated pottery, and we get it all the way to this point, and it's this era, this 1400 BC era, and then after that, the carinated pottery style disappears, and what we have is an imitation Canaanite carinated pottery. They couldn't get the good stuff anymore, so they went in for the, the knockoffs. It's all fascinating. So there we are, and we see the line. And then the Canaanites move back in. Poorer, beat up, with not nearly what they wanted, but there they are. So what else is happening here? Okay, 19th dynasty Egypt. Oh, there's all kinds of stuff in 19th dynasty Egypt. Ramses II, the Battle of Kadesh and Merneptah, and I've told you all about all of this stuff. Ramses II is suggested by the leftists as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because they're determined to push on us a 1200 or so origin for Israel in the Promised Land, because that's when we start seeing four-roomed houses in some places. They don't realize that Israel lived in tents, and when you move your tent every couple of months, you don't leave a lot of archaeology behind. We just can't find anything, or very little. Merneptah happens immediately afterwards. So Merneptah found Israel in the land around 1230 BC, and Ramses II around 1250 or so is supposed to have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Where do you get the 40 years? Well, they're lying about the 40 years. How does Israel have time to become a great nation? Well, they really weren't. None of that really happened. Most of the alternative theories about the conquest have been created because so-called moderate scholars in the middle of this century pushed a late date for the Exodus. The late date doesn't fit the archaeology. It doesn't fit the Bible, of course, but it doesn't fit the archaeology. And so what they've got is this wonderful theory that doesn't fit the literature, the only historical record we've got of the period, and it doesn't fit the archaeology that directly impacts the period. Now, what happens if you move it back 200 years to the time that the Bible says? Well, that's a right-wing conspiracy, terrible, conservative, knuckle dragger theory. Nobody believes that anymore. But if we take an early date for the Exodus and Conquest, it is the only hypothesis that makes sense of the data we actually have. And so, I always teach my students, 1446, that's the Exodus. Give or take a year or two, I tell to my upperclassmen. Freshmen need to memorize a date, 1446. Okay? They don't have any idea why that's important, but they need to know. They need to memorize it because it'll be on the test. Will this be on the test? Yes, it'll be on the test. Are you sure when the second coming is going to happen? Well, I'm sure it'll be after the final exam. I'm positive of that. Plan for it that way. Okay, we're going to give it up for the day. I'm not sure how far we've gone here.
So evidently during David and Solomon's time, most of the people lived in tents?
I would say so, yeah.
So,
Yeah, small villages were happening outside of Jerusalem.
Okay, but like you've got the people who went up to Dan and conquered that.
Yeah.
And they moved into the city that was already there.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some cities,
Right. Because
But-
I've been to the sites.
but it was very slow. It's a very slow thing. And when you think of a city, you know, don't be thinking of towering spires and great huge gates. It was not. If you could conquer the city with a chariot and 12 new arrows, you know, we're not talking about Fort Dumont at, you know.
So when did the Israelites start building more real cities?
During the divided kingdom, after the time of Solomon,
Okay.
you know, we start seeing that more and more. Really from about 1200 BC, we start seeing the typical four-room house. And those start becoming more common.
And that would be before David.
Oh, yes, yeah. But I will not say that everybody lived in an urban, they were mostly farming and shepherding. Yeah. Very few people lived in the cities. The cities were primarily for the royalty. Royalty and nobility would live in cities because the government had to have a central location in order to govern.
Thank you.
Okay? All right. Thank you for showing up and listening to piles of trivia. Bill was thanking me the other day for not planning a final exam. Yeah, I thought it would be really fun to wait until the last day of this and give you a 16-page, single-spaced set of essay questions. But I won't. I won't do that. God bless. Enjoy service this morning.